Hello, everyone. Cary Minden, CJM Realty here with my great friend Andrew Paul down in San Diego, Washington. Andrew's a VA loan specialist. That's our series we're doing as a former Navy SEAL. Thank you for your service, by the way. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
He's very into serving the veteran community, and you're in what, 42 states now? That's a lot of states. How'd you get to that many?
Yeah, it is a lot of states. I mean, I've been doing this for a while. I mean, I left active duty in 2007 and just went right into the mortgage business because that's a natural transition, right? So there I was, in the mortgage business in 2007. And, I left active duty. My last duty station was in San Diego. So I started doing loans in California. And then, guys, I did, loans for guys in my last platoon, and then all of a sudden they got orders to like Virginia, right? So they call me back, say, "Hey Andrew, like, well, I got orders to Virginia. Can you help me there?" And I was like, "Oh no!" And so I'm losing out on the opportunity to help my brothers as they're getting orders to different places. So it just happened very organically. Like everybody I know is in the military, so naturally their life is they're constantly moving around and PCS into different duty stations, and so I just started getting licensed in these states as my clients were moving around. And so 15 years later, here I am in all these 42 different states. So there you go.
Well, you're amazing for the service you do provide and did provide. One of the questions I had for you today is, what is the top misconceptions of the VA loan that you run into? One of the ones, I'll go first on this one, is I'll be talking to a seller. The seller will have the two things that I see all the time. They'll think that the VA loan will be more troublesome, especially at the appraisal level, and it's not as good as a regular loan. So, they throw a VA loan into the same category as a zero down conventional or something, where there's more risk to them as a seller, that it might go sideways.
Yeah, that's terrible. And I think where some of that comes from is, a zero down buyer must be a weak buyer. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it's an advantage to a veteran that they can go 100% financing. It doesn't mean that they aren't strong financially. It's quite the contrary. In fact, they may even have money to put down, but just choosing to take advantage of lower rates or whatever the case may be. So they're just using that as an advantage. I think the other piece of that, Cary, is if you look at who does the majority of the VA loans in the country, just given the sheer size of some of these big companies that do them, they're big companies, right? And some of them are a four-letter word, and they they're huge company, right? And so it's like,
or they shoot off into the sky.
Yeah, well, they don't do like a full pre-approval ahead of time, right? So when the veteran's getting started in the process, maybe they ask them a few questions, maybe they check their credit score, and then they give them a letter that says, "Hey, you can go shopping." And it isn't until like maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the process that an underwriter at that company is actually looking at the details. And they go, "Oh, we've got this problem, we've got that problem," and the deal falls apart. And just by the sheer number of loans that some of these bigger companies do, some of these bigger companies ends up almost being like the ambassador of the VA program. And so these listing agents that you're talking about, their experience with the VA program is really more of a reflection of those big companies and not really the merits of the VA benefit. So, if you work with a specialist, someone like me and my team, like we do a full pre-approval. So we close a VA loan in 21 days, like no problem. And we're looking at everything. So, I mean, there is certainty there for a seller and certainty there for a veteran buyer who's making an offer. So unfortunately, I think some of these bigger companies have given the VA program a bad name, and that's the experience that some of these listing agents have had. So,
within that, have you heard other? So I've heard like the VA appraisal is more difficult than a regular appraisal, and oh my goodness, you're going to have to do repairs.
yeah. So
we had a conversation on that because I represent the VA as a listing agent for foreclosures, VA foreclosures. And what I found is the VA, both at that level and for appraisals, they're looking for, get my camera here. Number one, they want the envelope to be sealed, so there's no moisture intrusion. It's a livable structure. There's going to be a heat source and a stove. Doesn't have to be a fridge, but there's got to be a stove, and doesn't have to be air conditioning, even though you might need it in Southern Florida. But there's got to be a heat source, a stove, and a sealed envelope. So those are things I see that are issues. But beyond that, I mean, have you had issues with appraisals or issues with sellers that you'd like to address?
I really have not had any major issues. I mean, when I first got into the business and we had this big glut of foreclosures, and there were a lot of houses that were left abandoned and in disrepair, there were houses that had issues. But the VA's requirement is this. The VA's requirement is that a house be safe, sound, and sanitary. That's what they want. Safe, sound, and sanitary. Now, from that, there are a few examples that the VA looks at. For example, let's say you're walking up to a house, and this is not an exhaustive list. There's a couple of, right? It's impossible to give you a defined list, but let's just say this is one that I've seen. For example, let's say you're walking up to a house and there's a set of stairs that lead up to the front door, and let's say it's 7 steps. Well, in most jurisdictions, even by building code, more than 3 or 4 steps, you're required to have a handrail. So that is something that an appraiser will see. If they go walk up and there's 7 steps that lead up and there's no hand railing, they will call out for the requirement to install a handrail. That's a safety issue. Let's say now keep in mind, a VA appraiser is not a home inspector, right? And they're not there to inspect the house. But when they walk into the home, let's say they look up at the ceiling and there's an electrical wire dangling from the ceiling where a chandelier used to be. Yeah, appraiser's going to go, well, I don't know if that's a live wire. I'm certainly not going to touch it to find out.
Right.
We'll call that out as a safety issue, right? That needs to be properly terminated or something. So it's things like that. So safe, sound, a sound house, to the point you mentioned, sealed envelope, no leaking roofs, no broken windows, because a broken window or leaky roof means moisture intrusion. So that's soundness. So safe, sound, and sanitary. It's kind of wide open. I've never had a sanitary issue ever called out. But it's like, I guess maybe in the 2000s, people were pissed at the bank and they were leaving crap, like literal dog feces.
I've seen it.
Right. Like we don't want a veteran moving into a house. By the way, the other piece of it, so ultimately we want it to be livable. We also don't want a veteran buying a house, getting a VA back loan, and they move in and they're instantly saddled with financial obligations that are necessary just to be able to keep the place livable for them to live in with their family, right? So really it comes down to setting up the veteran for success as they move into what's going to be their home, So, I've every now and then you get a knucklehead look, appraisers are people. That means that they look at things differently from one to the next. I've had appraisers go through a home where we're all holding our breath. What are they going to call out? And everybody knows it going in. And I've had situations like that where the appraiser goes through, they don't say anything. And then I've had houses, you're like, this thing's golden. Appraiser calls out a jiggly toilet handle, which is ridiculous, by the way. So I call the VA and I'm like, this is ridiculous. And they go, yeah, that's not required. And they waive it, right? So there's some variance there, but there's also room, if you know what to do, to call the VA and handle those things. So
perfect. Well, what I kind of conclude in this is, if you have an expert in your corner, whether it's your mortgage guy or a real estate guy like me, a lot of the known disadvantages of the VA loan really aren't disadvantages. So I've dealt with a lot of VA loans in my career, serving clients on both sides, the seller, normal seller, and the buyer side. And if you're proactive, you've got a mortgage guy in your corner or gal, but you happen to be a guy, in your corner that is willing to go to the bat and fight for you. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility on the back end in the VA. So awesome.
There is a lot of flexibility, Cary, and I will tell you, the VA is all about setting the veteran up for success. So look, they don't want a house to be run down that's going to be an albatross around their neck.
Yep.
And at the same time, if they want to make whatever accommodations they can to make it work for the veteran who wants to buy this house. So they're just trying to find that right balance. And I've always found the VA to be reasonable in working through these things.
That's awesome. Well, great to chat with you again here, Andrew, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. And if anyone wants to contact Andrew, his and my information will be here after this, and we'd love to do business.